If you've been following me for a while now, you'll know that my favourite process is trimming pots, and I'm very lucky in many ways, one of those being that many of you reach out wanting to send gifts, tools, such as this trimming tool made by Rami Imrak of RD Pottery and Tools. I'll leave links to his website and Instagram in the description below. He's recently started to produce tungsten carbide trimmers with lathe-turned wooden handles and beautifully sharp blades. Tungsten carbide tools are becoming more common slowly, so when he reached out and offered to send me this, well, how could I say no? And for transparency's sake, I wasn't paid to create this video, nor was making this video part of the agreement of him sending the tool. I am quite literally just a tool nut, and I get so many emails asking where I get my tungsten carbide trimmers. A video like this should be helpful, and if I can direct people to somebody I know who can supply them in a reliable way, then it's something I think I should do. Plus, if it gives me a reason to speak about tungsten carbide trimmers, well, that makes me a happy man. So please do go and check out his website. Rami releases these tools periodically and takes pre-orders every couple of weeks. Now, for those of you who don't know, these trimmers are made from tungsten carbide, a material that is incredibly strong and durable, which means it holds its sharp edge through thousands and thousands of pots. It's an alloy that's commonly used for drill tips and knives, but it does come with one downside, and that's that it's quite fragile and brittle, and if it's dropped onto the floor or used with clay that's very coarse and groggy, the metal can chip and shatter relatively easily. The handle has a different shape compared to those I've used previously. As you can see on the left, it comes to a very thin part, which I'm hoping is going to be quite comfortable to grip. As for the shape of the blade, it's quite interesting as it's both rounded and straight. I'm not entirely sure which part of the blade I'll use when trimming these bowls I've thrown simply for testing these tools. I store all of my tungsten carbide trimmers in a tray that's lined with foam and has tall sides so they can't roll out and fall onto the floor, as that's pretty much a death sentence for these. So please, if you do have tungsten carbide tools, be careful with them, as they're expensive typically, with single trimmers at the moment costing anywhere between £80 to £100. So, I've got 2 bowls to finish, and what you'll be seeing is my first experience with this trimmer. First, to fix that undulation in the rim, I'm going to flip the bowl upside down, tap center it so it spins in the middle, and then I'm going to trim away at the base to create an even, level surface. You'll find with these tungsten carbide turners that they need to be used on clay that's slightly firmer than leather hard. If your clay is too soft and you attempt to use these, it can be practically impossible to trim properly, as the material itself needs to have enough firmness to kind of hold itself together. It needs to have some resistance and some strength, otherwise these sharp blades just sink into the soft clay. With the base now flat, the bowl is sliced off the wheel and tap centered again with some slip on the bottom to hold the bowl in place. And you can see now how the bowl is spinning without any undulation. Here's how it looked before and after. So, if the rims of your pots are wobbling a little bit, you can try this to see if it fixes the problem. I then spent a moment perfecting the interior shape, and then turned this indentation slightly to make the angles more harsh and the lip sharper, both of which should cause the glaze that's eventually coated over this piece to react more interestingly. This piece was thrown with walls that were thick enough to take some trimming. This way the interior shape can be left lovely and curved, whilst the exterior is turned to have a more angular shape. I tried using the flat portion of the blade initially, as my intention is to create a flat plane at the top of this bowl. And by the way, that white lump you can see spinning around is just a piece of porcelain that was left over in my reclaim that found its way into this thrown pot. Next, with the turning tool, I switched to using the curved corner, which feels much better and more natural when focusing on removing masses of clay. If you're trimming with the tungsten carbide turning tool and you're trying to use the entire expanse of a long portion of the blade, you'll find that the blade chatters more as you do this, leaving a rough, textured surface. Whereas if you use a smaller point of contact, like just the curved corner of this blade, you'll be able to remove clay a lot more easily without it bouncing ever so slightly on the surface. I then skim over these areas with a sharp metal kidney to smooth over the more prominent turning marks. And really, that's how I view using these turning tools. They aren't so much for finishing, rather they're for removing mass from a piece to shape it, before finishing the pot properly with a different set of trimmers that leave smoother, more burnished surfaces. Whereas these sharp blades are just very good at removing a lot of material very quickly. I love that I can rest my thumb on the actual blade itself to add stability and control to my movements. As with sharp tungsten carbide tools especially, you do need to be careful, as you can see here just how easily it tears through the stoneware. But all it takes is one wrong movement and for the blade to catch at the wrong angle, for the blade to eat a hole through the walls, or for the entire pot to be torn off the wheel and out of its restraints. The thing is, as the blade is so sharp, if you make a mistake, what happens thereafter will probably be worse, and you run the risk of damaging the tool if the clay carries it around or flings it to one side. So what's really important before you invest in a set of tools like this, in my opinion, is experience. Yes, these tools are glorious, and they make trimming a real pleasure. But if you don't have much experience trimming, you may find learning to use these actually rather difficult. And to go back to the analogy I always use, you'd never learn how to drive in a Ferrari. And that's really the case with these. Moreover, and this is something I spoke about in another recent video, you shouldn't be purchasing tools like this with the idea that they're going to radically make you a better trimmer. They won't. And I know lots of beginners who have bought tools like this only to send me messages about how they can't get them to trim nicely. For me, it doesn't matter what kind of turning tools I'm using, I'll get the same results no matter what. It's my hands, really, that are doing most of the work. Sharp blades like this only make the process of removing clay more efficient. They don't leave your pots with cleaner surfaces. And in reality, for that process, I use steel trimmers that are absurdly cheap, like this. They have relatively blunt blades, but they leave a surface that's more polished and smooth. And you can see that here visually, as this section I'm trimming takes on a more shiny surface. But I equally could have done all the trimming with this tool, and much of it comes down to knowing how to hold it, which parts of the blade to use, and how fast you spin the wheel. So far so good, and the tool's handle has been very comfortable to hold throughout this process, which is a good thing for those long days of turning. As for hollowing out the footwell, well, it works for a couple of passes, but if you're trimming deep feet, the angle of the blade on the metal itself makes it rather difficult to trim past a certain point without the handle and ferrule colliding with the protruding foot ring itself. So I switch back to one of my old, trusty steel tools, as the blade on the tungsten tool is beveled, and it only cuts when the tool is held at a very specific angle. And in the case with a foot like this, I literally can't hold it at that angle without the tool itself knocking into the foot. So I use a steel tool like this that has a blade that is entirely flat, which can be lowered into the clay, held in a really firm, tight grip, beginning in the middle and then gliding the tool outward. If the raised foot ring wasn't there, flattening the bottom wouldn't be an issue. But nobody makes tungsten carbide blades that are very thin and flat, probably for good reason, as they'd be so fragile. And these steel tools do work wonderfully. They can be sharpened easily, but the material, the steel, does wear away quickly, as ceramic is very abrasive. Even this body, which does look mostly smooth, contains enough fine particles of grog to quickly wear down the metal of most tools. In this instance, I was able to trim the foot down deeper than I thought, leaving the walls on the outside of the foot ring looking relatively raised in comparison. This is a sign that you can afford to trim more of the exterior than you thought, as ideally, in terms of proportion and shape, you want the walls on the outside of the foot to be level with the base inside the foot. This way there's less excess weight left in the pot, leaving you with a lighter, more balanced vessel. The straight and curved blade has actually come in very handy, as I can use it for removing material and then flattening it out, whereas previously I'd probably be switching between two tools to achieve the same thing. I then bevel the foot, both on the outer and inside edge, and this is something I would never do with a tungsten carbide tool, simply due to how sharp they are, as one wrong move on this delicate point could tear away the entire foot or create a large gouge in one side of it. Whereas with a relatively blunt stainless steel tool, I can delicately lower the blade into the clay, leaving a burnished surface with less of a chance of the tool catching and tearing. And yes, I'm using the smooth glazed side of my maker's mark to burnish the foot itself. The pot is then removed and placed on a high pressure laminate bat, which is very smooth and has zero chance of leaving a wood grain imprint in the clay, which can happen. So with all of that being said, what I'm trying to get across is that a tungsten carbide tool really is situational. It shouldn't be used for everything, and delicate turning like this I usually do with steel tools. Yet, when it comes to removing a lot more mass from the bottom, then I immediately switch over to the tungsten tools. And so far, I really love this groove I can clasp my hand around. It feels really secure, and it provides you with multiple ways of holding it, depending on how you're trimming. Typically, I hold these turners very close to the blade. They're gripped extraordinarily tightly, and I'm even bracing my hands together, which you can just about make out in the back, as I'm pushing my right hand against the thumb of my left hand, all of which adds to the stability of my movements. You don't want to hold a trimmer like this close to the back of the handle, as you'll have far less control, and if anything does go wrong and the handle is pulled out of your grip, there's simply less to hold onto, and I can envision more going wrong. But these blades are lovely and sharp. Rami has done an excellent job shaping these, and I'll certainly be adding it to my arsenal of tungsten carbide trimming tools. You'll notice that I only ever use a small portion of the blade when removing material, and whilst this does leave more distinct grooves on the surface, at least the grooves are smooth. They aren't chattered or textured, yet that can be something you leave purposefully as a decorative feature, but it's not for me, not on my pots. In this case, I'm even using the thumb of my left hand to help stabilise the blade, as no matter what, I want the blade to cut very straight and strict lines. I never want the clay underneath to influence the movement of it. Instead, if there is a slight lump or bump that's spinning around, I want the turning tool to just sever it, removing it, returning the clay to spinning perfectly true. Now, this might be easier said than done, as if you are a beginner and you are making pots that are slightly wobbly, the spinning clay is going to have much more of an influence on your turning, thus making the process more difficult, as you have to work much harder at stabilising the blade so it trims through the undulations, rather than following them and gradually exaggerating them, leaving you with a pot that's actually more wobbly than what you began with. Now, the obvious thing to compare this tool with is one of my bison turning tools, made by the legendary Phil Poberka. They are similar in many ways, the shape of the handle and the blade, even the ferrule that holds the two together. But as many of you know, I'm sure, getting hold of his tools is next to impossible, and I do feel relatively bad about it, as over the years, I've recommended his tools constantly to many of you, and I know just how frustrating it can be to actually get a hold of them, as Phil's waiting list is rather archaic, and in some cases they can take 2 to even 3 years to be delivered. As a result, I've always thought there was somewhat of a hole in the market, especially here in Europe, and as a potter who loves the trimming process, I'm glad there are more options, as there are nowadays many more potters in the world. At least that's what it feels like. This craft has really seen an explosion of popularity over the past 10 years or so, and whilst there's been an influx in pot makers, the number of people making specialised pottery tools, such as tungsten carbide trimmers like this, has remained relatively the same, meaning that the demand far outweighs the supply. I've seen a few comments thrown around saying that this new group of people making tungsten carbide trimmers are copying Phil, and I think that's unfair to some degree. Kidneys, ribs, throwing gauges, steel trimmers, calipers, tons of tools really, no matter where they're made or by who, typically look similar. And I don't think gatekeeping them behind one particular maker is necessarily healthy for the craft, be it pottery or tool making. Tungsten carbide turning tools have made me a better maker, and if more ceramicists can get their hands on tools of this quality, then that's only going to see us all make better work. And if I was Phil, I think I would feel proud that I've inspired a generation of new tool makers, as if you think pottery or stained glass or basket making are endangered crafts, then crafts such as tool making must be critically endangered. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the subject. I'd love to hear what you think too, so if this does interest you, please do leave a comment. Otherwise, a huge thank you to Rami of RD Pottery and Tools for sending me such a lovely gift. As for how I look after these tools, I'll soak a sponge and then really wring it out so it's almost dry, and then I use this to clean inside the blade and the outside of it. I don't do this all the time, as really there's no harm leaving dry clay on the blades, but you certainly don't want to leave wet material on these for too long. Then perhaps every half year or so, I oil the handles of all my trimmers. Well, not the stainless steel tools, but those made by craftspeople and makers that I really care about. I look after them with great care, as with any luck, tools like this should be able to last my lifetime, provided they don't fall on the ground and smash. But so far so good. I've somehow miraculously not managed to break any of mine yet, and the padded tray they're stored in really is a game changer. So if you are thinking about investing in some turning tools like this, I really recommend making one. Anyway, that's my review of the tool. It's short and simple, and there isn't much to say really about it. It works, and I'm sure if Rami continues to make these for another 10 or 20 years, they're only going to become more beautiful and more of a joy to use. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch. I'll leave a few relevant links in the description of this video, and as always, I'll see you next time.